What's up, designers, and welcome back to Rempton Games. If you've been playing trading card games for a while, you've probably seen an overpowered new card come out and totally wreck the meta to the point where it seems like everyone is using it. On the other hand, you've probably opened entire packs of cards and felt like every single one of them was useless trash that nobody would ever play. Why can't trading card designers just design balanced cards without some of them either being broken or terrible? Well, the short answer is that, depending on how you define balance, it can be a literally impossible task. In today's episode of TCG Design Academy, we're going to take a look at why it's impossible, why that's not necessarily a bad thing, and how you can design your game to make it easier to at least get pretty close to balance most of the time. The first and most important reason why it's impossible to balance a trading card game is basically a mathematical one. Trading card games release hundreds of new cards every year, and while some of these might be reprints, most of them are going to be completely new cards with new abilities, and not all of these abilities are going to be directly comparable to each other. Take two abilities that are extremely common in all sorts of trading card games: drawing cards and dealing damage. Assuming that the two cards cost the same amount of in-game resources, how do you determine what the right amount of cards to draw and damage to deal is so that they're equally powerful? Through trial and error, playtesting, and experience, you can probably get pretty close, but you're never going to find that perfect exact balance. Even if you had some kind of magical computer that could spit out the perfect ratio between cards drawn and damage dealt, the odds of that ratio containing whole numbers is basically zero. Hypothetically, let's suppose that computer determined that drawing two cards is equal to dealing 3.568 damage. Unless you want your players to keep track of the decimals, which you don't, you'll either have to round this number up to 4 damage or down to 3 damage. However, 3 damage might mean that the card's considered weak, while 4 damage could mean that it's considered a bit too powerful. Same thing can happen with resource costs, deck building points, etc. Your ability to balance the cards will always be limited by the number of factors that you can adjust and the resolution of those factors. Suppose you've decided that a card that draws 2 other cards should cost 3 resources. Well, the truth is that the value of this card is never going to be a perfectly even number. Maybe it should actually cost 2.7 or 3.1, but the best you can do is get close enough and try to find the nearest value. The small differences in power level caused by this kind of rounding might seem unimportant, and you might be willing to call a game balanced as long as the values and costs are as close as possible to their ideal values. In reality, however, any difference in power level will be sought out and exploited by optimizers and tournament players, also called spikes. Even if balance was a developer's only goal and they were able to get cards as close to balanced as possible, there would still be a gradient of power that would lead to some cards being considered bad and others good. The second factor here is that design space isn't an infinite resource, and in addition to the difficulty of balancing disparate effects, you'll often have to make cards with abilities that are similar to other cards that already exist, which naturally puts these cards in direct competition with each other. If you only make a few cards that deal direct damage, then players might be willing to play all of them in their direct damage decks. However, as you keep releasing cards, eventually you'll cross a threshold where players no longer have room in their decks to play every single direct damage card, and they'll have to start making decisions about which to keep and which to drop. What this means is that there will always be a ceiling to the number of cards that are playable in a particular format. What this exact number is varies from game to game and format to format, but looking at the number of different cards that show up in various TCG tournaments, I think the number tends to be around 300 to 400. Because of this, you could theoretically limit a format to only the 300 to 400 good cards, and theoretically make a format where every single card is considered playable. However, this is not only impractical, but it's unmaintainable. Unfortunately, even this much is built on the flawed assumption that a card has a single power level, but this isn't true. In fact, every card's power level varies depending on their context and environment. This can play out in a few different ways. First, format matters. Some cards might not be considered worthy of being placed in a constructed deck where each and every card is meticulously considered. However, that same card might be considered very strong in a draft where you're building from a more limited pool of cards. The opposite can also be true. Some cards require very specific combos or even building your entire deck around them to make them good. Take the Dark Magician, for example. Konami is constantly releasing cards designed to summon, enhance, and support this single monster, and those decks are constantly cycling in and out of competitive relevance. However, the Dark Magician would be a terrible card to get in a draft, because it's hard to summon, it doesn't do anything on its own, and its stats aren't even that good. This brings us to a different kind of context: the other cards in that environment. Suppose we had 2 green magic creatures that were basically identical in every way. They had the same mana cost, the same stats, and the same ability to give +2 power to a particular creature type. The only difference is which creature type is affected. One of them boosts elves, and the other boosts aurochs. Which is stronger? Well, the one that boosts elves, because elves are a much more common creature type in Magic. Although these cards are nearly identical, one might be considered pretty good, while the other is basically worthless, just due to the history and context of the game. New cards being released can also change an older card's value. Suppose you have a Togetic card, but nothing good to evolve it into. Its value might be pretty low. However, if the next set releases a really powerful, fancy new Togekiss card, then all of a sudden the value of that Togetic has just gone up. A card's value can even change from one game to the next based on what your opponent is playing, which is why sideboards exist. Another reason why the cards can be tough to balance, and this can be tough to hear, is because the designers are only human. And I don't just mean that they mess up and make mistakes, although that can happen. I mean that even the best and most dedicated designers and playtesters have a limit on how much they can balance the cards due to time, manpower, and resource limitations. Your average trading card game doesn't have that big of a team. Even Magic the Gathering probably only has a couple dozen people making cards at any given time, and most teams are a lot smaller than that. Players, on the other hand, can number in the millions. This means that the collective player base can get more experience playing with new cards in the first day than the design team can in an entire year. This is especially true for open-ended cards that create a lot of possibilities. It's very possible for the players to find an overpowered use for these cards that the designers didn't intend, and that totally breaks the card. In addition, designing a trading card game is a moving target. Once the cards are actually released, the context is more static, and it's possible to evaluate the cards in their final states. However, as mentioned earlier, a card's power level depends on its environment, and nowhere is that environment less stable than during development. Not only is the card itself going through changes, but all the cards around it are changing as well. This chaotic environment makes it much more difficult to balance the cards, because every little change can send a ripple effect that changes the power level of different cards up or down. The difficulty of the design process is especially relevant when the designers are working with new mechanics and new types of cards because they don't have any context for them. It's much easier to balance cards that are similar to other cards that already exist because you can use your experience to guide you. When you're trying something new, it can be a lot harder to judge. Combine this with the fact that games should basically always be trying new things, and some things are always going to be a bit off in power level. Everything we've been talking about so far has been under the assumption that balance is the #1 goal of the designers, but this isn't really the case either. A designer's primary goal should be to make the game fun, and while balance can be a part of this, players tend not to have fun when they're playing a game that's completely unbalanced. It's far from the only part. Balance matters to designers because it matters to players, but it doesn't matter to all players equally. It matters the most to spikes, who are primarily concerned with winning and optimizing their decks. However, this only represents a small subset of the players. There are lots of other players that play for other reasons, and to them, balance might be less important. Just like some cards are designed to be tournament staples, other cards might be considered bad or weak because they're designed for a different purpose and to appeal to a different kind of player. For example, some cards might have very open-ended combo potential, and this might make a certain type of player's mind race with the possibilities, even if none of those possibilities are necessarily as good as the meta decks. Or a card might appeal to certain types of players just because it has high stats or can do cool things, even if those things are too impractical or inconsistent to actually be used competitively. Tournament players might look down on these types of cards, but if there's a certain audience that really enjoys them, then having these types of cards in the game is good for the game overall. Some cards might actually be intentionally designed to be underpowered because it would be bad for the game if they were too good. Cards with an element of randomness to them often fall into this category. While they can be fun to play and make cool things happen, I don't think a lot of tournament players would be very happy if games were being decided based on the flip of a coin or the roll of a die. Another example is cards that have a fun quirk or mini-game associated with them, such as Goblin Game. These types of cards are interesting and can be fun every now and then, but would get very irritating very quickly and can definitely slow down the game. These types of cards tend to be designed so that they're fun to play for the players that enjoy them, but weak enough that tournament players don't feel compelled to use them. The final reason why trading card games aren't balanced is because having a range of cards with different power levels is actually good for the game. You can't have the excitement of drawing a really cool, powerful card unless there are less powerful cards to contrast it with. In addition, being able to determine which cards are good and which are bad is one of the main skills that comes with playing a trading card game, and is one of the main ways that you can grow and improve as a player. This is especially true when drafting. A huge part of the challenge of drafting is having to make a playable deck from a very limited pool of cards, and being able to evaluate and determine which cards are worth picking is one of the main things that separates good drafters from bad ones. Finally, having a range of different power levels allows players to discover hidden gems, cards that seem bad on the surface but are actually very good. It can feel good to recognize the potential hidden within a card that everyone else thinks is bad, and this is only possible if there are some cards that actually are bad. Although perfectly balancing a trading card game is impossible and isn't even desirable, it doesn't mean that we can ignore balance completely. Unbalanced, overpowered cards can have a very negative effect on a trading card game overall, to the point that I've actually made a whole video about how to spot and identify some of the most common types of broken cards, which you should check out after this video. In general, however, there are a few main ways that we can design our trading card game to be more balanceable, and hopefully avoid major balance mistakes. The first is by making sure that your game has enough levers that can be pulled to adjust the power level of each individual card. The most common example of this is a resource system either to play the card or include the card in your deck, and you can adjust that cost to roughly match the power level of the card. Some other examples include changing a card's level in Yu-Gi-Oh!, determining whether a spell should be an instant or sorcery in Magic the Gathering, changing the amount of energy required to activate a Pokemon's abilities in Pokemon, or raising or lowering a card's strength points in Gwent. If a game isn't designed with enough of these levers, it can be difficult to balance the cards, and it limits the amount of cards that can be designed without introducing power creep. Another way to balance these games is to introduce answer cards, which are cards that are designed to keep the power level of other cards in check. For example, suppose you're introducing a new faction into your game, and you're worried that the faction might be a bit overpowered. You could introduce another card or handful of cards that have an advantage against this new faction, to keep them from being too powerful. Key with these answer cards is to make sure that they don't completely shut down the other decks or prevent people from playing them. They shouldn't be a one-card instant win button against that other faction, but they should give players a way to compete if that faction turns out to be too powerful. Finally, make sure you can see the forest for the trees. Cards in a trading card game aren't played alone. They're part of a larger deck, and each deck is just part of a bigger metagame. Balancing isn't something that you do once and you're done. It's a continuous process of reacting to changes in the game and player base. Suppose you release a new set that you think is balanced, but it turns out that one of the factions is underpowered. In the next set, you might need to give that faction a bit of a boost just to bring it up to the same level as the other factions. Finally, balancing cards, much like making a YouTube channel, is all about listening to feedback. You can give me your feedback in the comments down below. Tell me if you like this video and what other topics you'd like me to talk about in the future. If you like this video, you can also give feedback in the form of hitting that like button or subscribing so you don't miss more videos like this in the future. If you did enjoy this video, make sure to check out the previous entries in my TCG Design Academy series, which is linked on screen. And join me next time for my ultimate risk strategy guide. Until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.